Hello there. I'm so glad you've decided to join me tonight for a quiet journey through time. As we prepare to delve into the grand tapestry of Roman history, I invite you to simply let go. Release any tension from your day. Settle into your most comfortable spot. Perhaps dim the lights and just allow my voice and the unfolding narrative to be a gentle guide. There's no rush, no pressure, just an opportunity to explore, to learn, and to simply be. If you find yourself drifting pleasantly with these explorations, and you appreciate the quiet insights we share, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider hitting that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more curious, seeking minds like yours. Feel free to share this journey with anyone you feel might appreciate its calming contemplation. And if you'd like to continue these tranquil expeditions into history with me, please do subscribe to the channel, and perhaps even tap that little bell icon so you'll know whenever we embark on a new adventure. Your quiet support means the world, and it truly allows me to keep crafting these narratives for you. The Republic's last breath, Caesar, Antony, and the rise of Augustus. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome had been a republic. This was a system of governance forged in the fires of kingship overthrown. Society that prided itself on liberty and the res publica, the public thing, a shared commonwealth where power in theory resided with the people. For centuries, Rome's legions were composed of citizen militias, farmers called to arms when needed, serving for short campaigns, loyal to the republic that guaranteed their land and liberty upon their return. But by the late 2nd century BC, prolonged campaigns across vast distances, in Spain, in Africa, in the East, the army professionalized. In 133 BC, during an election for the following year's tribunes, Tiberius Gracchus was attacked and bludgeoned to death by a senatorial mob, led by his own cousin, using broken benches as weapons. This was an act of profound treason, a shocking violation of centuries of tradition against armed forces within the sacred Pomerium, the city's religious boundary. He seized the city, purged his enemies, then left for a foreign war. He was the quintessential traditional military hero, a living legend. He had achieved unparalleled glory, famously clearing the entire Mediterranean of pirates in a mere 3 months, a feat thought impossible. Heavily in debt from his own lavish political campaigns, his generous public games, and achieve their individual aims, would secretly forge an alliance in 60 BC. It was a clandestine compact, a binding oath to support each other's political agendas, pooling their vast influence in resources, Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's immense wealth, Caesar's popular appeal and political cunning. This was not a formal, legal entity recognized by the Republic's constitution, but an extra-legal shadow government, a powerful triumvirate that would soon dictate the course of Rome. The stage was set. The cracks were undeniable, and the fragile constitution of Rome, battered by decades of internal strife, was about to be put to its ultimate, catastrophic test. In his ambitious bribes, Caesar compensated with audacious charisma, brilliant intellect, and a relentless drive for power. A master orator and politician, he had painstakingly cultivated immense popularity with the Roman plebs through populist measures and grand public spectacles designed to win their votes and devotion. He understood Rome's shifting social and political undercurrents better than perhaps anyone of his generation, and he possessed an uncanny ability to exploit them to his advantage. Yet, despite his political acumen and noble birth, he lacked the immediate military glory and the deep pockets of his 2 potential allies, making their partnership strategically essential for his own meteoric rise to power. He then expanded Rome's dominion into the east, conquering vast new territories, reorganizing provinces from Syria to Judea, bringing immense wealth and prestige back to Rome. He was celebrated with multiple triumphs, the highest military honor a Roman general could attain, and commanded legions of loyal veterans. The Senate both hailed him as its champion and eyed him nervously, wary of his unparalleled popularity and potential for ambition. Despite his military genius, He lacked the political finesse and patience to navigate Rome's complex internal politics without powerful allies. And he resented the Senate's constant obstruction, their unwillingness to ratify his eastern settlements, and their failure to grant his veteran soldiers the land they had been promised. Promises a general could not break without losing the loyalty of his army. Marius, however, returned, leading a bloody counterpurge, unleashing his own vengeance. He was arguably the wealthiest man in Rome, perhaps even the entire Roman world. His fortune built through a combination of shrewd investments, audacious opportunism, and outright ruthless exploitation. He famously owned the city's private fire brigade, which, legend has it, would often arrive at a burning property and offer to extinguish the flames, only after negotiating a rock-bottom price for the property from its desperate owner. He had achieved significant military glory by ruthlessly crushing the massive slave revolt led by Spartacus. Caius, though his efforts were somewhat overshadowed when Pompey arrived later to mop up the remaining rebel forces and claimed much of the credit. Crassus, despite his immense wealth, still deeply craved a military renown to match Pompey's, and he yearned for a powerful proconsular command in the east to further enrich himself and cement his legacy. Sulla, upon his triumphant return from the east, enacted his infamous proscriptions. Lists of enemies of the state were posted in the Forum, condemning thousands of Romans, senators, equities, and wealthy citizens to death without trial, their property confiscated and auctioned off, the reward for those who brought in their heads. It was a systematic reign of terror, designed not only to eliminate political rivals, but also to replenish the state's coffers. Sulla eventually laid down his unprecedented dictatorship, believing he had purged the republic of its ills and restored it to its former glory. But he had, instead, left behind a terrifying blueprint with enough loyal legions. Any ambitious man could seize absolute power, and the republic's fragile institutions were utterly powerless to stop him. It was the first time in centuries that a Roman tribune had been killed in such a manner. The Senate, once a respected body of experienced statesmen, was often paralyzed by petty rivalries, deep-seated corruption, and obstructionism, more concerned with the aristocratic privilege than with the effective governance of a sprawling empire. It clung desperately to archaic traditions and procedural norms, while the very fabric of Roman society was tearing apart at the seams. Into this volatile environment, into this crucible of power vacuums and desperate ambitions, stepped three men, each immensely powerful, each with vast resources, and each, in their own unique way, determined to bend Rome to their will. They would forge an unofficial, secret alliance that historians now call the First Triumvirate. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius met a similar, equally violent fate, hunted down and killed, along with thousands of his supporters, after the Senate issued a terrifying Senatus Consultum, Ultimum, an ultimate decree that effectively suspended civil liberties, authorizing magistrates to use any means necessary to preserve the republic, including killing citizens without trial. This was no longer just political disagreement or oratorical combat. It was civil war on the streets. Haikai had bravely, perhaps naively, highlighted Rome's core problem: profound social and economic inequality, and the elite's brutal, chilling answer: eliminate dissenters through extra-legal violence. The precedent was set. If you couldn't win by law, you could win by force. Soldiers now served 4 decades under specific generals who increasingly promised them land, plunder, and a pension upon discharge. Marius, a self-made military genius, a new man from outside the traditional aristocracy, had famously reformed the army, opening its ranks to the landless poor. While this solved Rome's critical manpower crisis and allowed him to secure victory after victory, it inadvertently deepened the loyalty of soldiers to their general who promised them land and spoils upon discharge, rather than to the abstract notion of the republic. Sulla, a proud, unbending, and intensely conservative aristocrat, deeply resented Marius's populist methods and his constant breaking of traditional norms. Their rivalry exploded into a horrific struggle for control of Rome itself. This created a new, dangerous, and deeply personal bond. The legions became loyal, not to the distant, often bickering Senate or the abstract notion of the Republic, but to their charismatic, successful commanders. These generals, now essentially private warlords commanding their own personal armies, could leverage this loyalty to achieve political aims back in Rome. This personal devotion, love allegiance to the state, would prove to be the deadliest poison in the Republic's veins. Its intricate machinery was built on carefully balanced institutions. The venerable, albeit aristocratic, Senate, a council of elders wielding immense moral authority. Consider the tragic tale of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. In the late 2nd century BC, these eloquent, idealistic tribunes of the plebs, a magistracy specifically designed to protect the common people from aristocratic overreach, recognized the dire plight of the landless. They proposed agrarian reforms aiming to redistribute public land, Ager Publicus land conquered by Rome, and technically belonging to the state, which had been illegally or excessively occupied by wealthy senators. They believed that restoring these lands to the poor was not just a matter of social justice, but essential to rejuvenate the Republic's citizen base and its military strength. But the conservative Senate, comprised largely of the nobiles, who stood to lose vast tracts of their illegally held latifundia, viewed these reforms as a revolutionary assault on their property rights and, more importantly, on their traditional power and practical influence. The annually elected consuls, who served as chief magistrates and military commanders, leading the state in both peace and war, and the assemblies of the people, meant to ensure the voice of the citizens was heard, particularly through the tribunes of the plebs, who held sacrosanct power to veto laws and protect the common folk. This elaborate dance of power, this delicate system of checks and balances, had allowed a small city-state on the Tiber to conquer first the Italian peninsula, then the Mediterranean, until its vast reach extended from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the misty shores of Britannia. But the very success of the Republic, its relentless and unprecedented expansion, began to unravel its core. The enormous wealth flowing into Rome, the plunder from sacked cities like Carthage and Corinth, the endless tribute from newly conquered provinces, the vast influx of war captives turned into slaves, did not enrich all Romans equally. Instead, it funneled disproportionately into the hands of a small, powerful elite, the noblesse. This led to the proliferation of vast aristocratic estates, known as latifundia, which swallowed up small family farms and were worked by tens of thousands of slaves. These enslaved laborers, often brutally exploited, generated immense profits for their aristocratic masters, where they simultaneously displaced the free citizen farmers, who had for centuries been the backbone of Roman society and its legions. Dispossessed and desperate, these once proud landholders were forced to abandon their ancestral lands and migrate to Rome, swelling the ranks of the landless, impoverished urban plebs. These were citizens, yes, theoretically, with a vote in the assemblies, but they were also a volatile, easily swayed mass, hungry for bread and entertainment, a dangerous force within the very democratic mechanisms designed to represent them. Adding to this immense social pressure was a seismic shift in the fundamental nature of the Roman army. The warning signs of this systemic breakdown were not subtle. They erupted in brutal spasms of violence that repeatedly stained the sacred ground of the Forum with Roman blood. The debates were fierce, the political maneuvering unprecedented in its ruthlessness. This terrifying cycle of political violence and military ambition culminated in the full-blown civil wars between two titans of the late Republic, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BC, Sulla, splaged by Marius's political maneuvering that stripped him of a key military command, committed the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. By the mid-1st century BC, a mere 2 decades after Sulla's reign of terror, Rome was a simmering cauldron of ambition, fear, and unparalleled opportunity. First, there was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, then Marcus Licinius Crassus, and finally Gaius Julius Caesar. Though from an ancient patrician family, the Iuli, his branch was relatively impoverished and largely out of the political limelight. These three vastly different but equally ambitious men, driven by a shared desire to circumvent the entrenched power of the conservative Senate, with the secret pact of the first triumvirate now firmly in place, the stage was set for each of its powerful members to pursue their ambitions. For Pompey, it meant the ratification of his eastern settlements and land for his veterans, which the Senate had stubbornly denied. For Crassus, it meant favorable financial legislation and a lucrative military command in the east. But for Gaius Julius Caesar, the junior member of this formidable alliance, the triumvirate was his springboard to truly immense power and glory. They fought tribe against tribe, often falling prey to internal jealousies and betrayals. He crushed the Helvetius, defeated Ariovistus, pacified vast swaths of territory, and even launched daring expeditions across the English Channel to Britain, an act of incredible prestige that brought Roman eagles to entirely new, mythical lands. Each victory brought him more plunder, more slaves, and more legions, as his successes were celebrated back in Rome. He was expanding Rome's empire on an unprecedented scale, transforming a loose collection of disparate tribes into Roman provinces. Lycia fell, and Vercingetorix, in a poignant act of surrender, laid down his arms before Caesar, effectively ending large-scale Gaulish resistance. It was a victory of immense proportions, a strategic masterpiece that solidified Caesar's reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. Caesar, a brilliant strategist and tactician, meticulously exploited these divisions. He had used the vast wealth plundered from Gaul to pay off his enormous debts, to bribe key politicians. They insisted Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen to face potential prosecution for alleged misdeeds during his time in Gaul. This was a direct threat to his career, his wealth, and potentially his life. Caesar understood the game. If he returned without his army, he was vulnerable. If he refused, he was an enemy of the state. The ultimate decision lay before him at a small, unassuming river in northern Italy, a river whose name would forever become synonymous with a point of no return, and to build magnificent public works in Rome, further endearing himself to the common people. Most importantly, he had forged an unshakable bond of loyalty with his legions. These hardened veterans, having fought and bled with him for years, saw him not just as their commander, but as their champion, their path to glory and wealth. They would follow him anywhere. The first triumvirate, the secret alliance that had propelled Caesar to his command, was fracturing. Crassus, seeking his own military glory, had launched a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east and was killed in battle at Carrhae in 53 BC. His death removed the financial and political balance point between Caesar and Pompey. Then, in 54 BC, Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. Her death severed the last personal bond between the two remaining titans. Without Crassus and Julia, the alliance swiftly dissolved into open rivalry. The Gaulish tribes, initially disunited, slowly began to recognize the existential threat posed by Roman subjugation. The conservative faction in the Senate, the Optimates, led by staunch Republicans like Cato the Younger, had always deeply distrusted Caesar's populist tendencies and his relentless pursuit of personal glory. They saw him as a dangerous revolutionary, another Sulla in the making. With Crassus gone, Pompey was increasingly drawn into their orbit, becoming the de facto champion of the Senate against Caesar. A new leader emerged, one who possessed the charisma and strategic mind to unite much of Gaul against the conqueror, Vercingetorix, chief of the Arverni. Vercingetorix understood that, in open battle, the disciplined Roman legions were often invincible. He opted for a scorched earth policy, turning Gaulish towns and villages to deny Caesar's army supplies, and adopting a strategy of harassing raids and defensive strongholds. His campaigns were characterized by lightning-fast marches, Vercingetorix. With his unified army, fortified himself in the hill fort of Alesia. Caesar, faced with a seemingly impregnable position, executed one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. He built not one, but two massive circumvallation walls around Alesia, an inner wall protecting his army from the besieged Gauls, and an outer wall protecting his army from a massive Gaulish relief force that was attempting to break the siege from outside. Trapped between two Roman fortifications, the Gauls in Alesia slowly starved, while Caesar's legions fought desperately on two fronts simultaneously. It was a testament to Roman engineering, logistics, and the sheer tenacity of Caesar's soldiers. Audacious engineering feats, such as the rapid construction of a bridge over the Rhine in just 10 days to intimidate the Germans, and an almost superhuman ability to inspire loyalty in his men. He understood the art of siege warfare, of pitched battles, and of psychological intimidation. His ambition was boundless, yet he still lacked the military renown of Pompey and the staggering wealth of Crassus. He knew exactly where to find both, in the untamed, wealthy, and politically volatile lands of Gaul. In 58 BC, through the influence of Pompey and Crassus, Caesar secured for himself an extraordinary proconsular command, the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. This was no ordinary posting. It granted him not just a vast territory to administer, but also, crucially, for legions of Rome's finest soldiers for an unprecedented period of 5 years, later extended to 10. This command placed Caesar squarely at the edge of the known Roman world, bordering a vast, unconquered, and fiercely independent land known simply as Gaul, a land of diverse Celtic tribes, rich in resources, but perceived by Romans as a chaotic, fragmented, barbarian wilderness. For Caesar, this was not merely a governorship. It was a personal empire in the making, an opportunity to carve out a legacy that would eclipse even Pompey's. Caesar's first decisive act, one that would plunge him into nearly a decade of continuous warfare, came almost immediately. Two major migrations were on the move. The Helvetii, a large Celtic tribe, were preparing to migrate through Roman territory, and the Suebi, a powerful Germanic tribe under their feared leader Ariovistus, were crossing the Rhine, threatening Gaulish allies of Rome. Caesar, ever alert to opportunity, seized upon these movements as a pretext. He swiftly mobilized his legions, claiming he was protecting Roman provinces and Rome's Gaulish allies. What began as defensive action quickly morphed into an aggressive campaign of conquest. The Gauls were a formidable foe, brave warriors, fierce individualists, but tragically disunited. Over the next 8 years, Caesar marched his legions across the vast and varied landscapes of Gaul. Yet, his ambition and the sheer scale of his conquests began to stir a powerful counter-reaction. The climactic moment of the Gallic Wars came in 52 BC, at the siege of Alesia. Despite a valiant struggle by Vercingetorix and the desperation of his relief force, Caesar's double siege held. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the political situation back in Rome was growing increasingly tense. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now grew increasingly wary of his former partner's burgeoning power and unparalleled popularity. Caesar, meanwhile, was far away, finishing his campaigns in Gaul, but he was meticulously aware of the machinations in Rome, as his extraordinary proconsular command drew to a close. The Senate, driven by fear and suspicion, began to issue demands. The die, it seemed, was almost cast, as Caesar brought his unprecedented conquest of Gaul to a close. A storm brewed in Rome, a tempest of political maneuvering, fear, and escalating demands. The first triumvirate was dead, its fragile balance shattered by the death of Crassus in Parthia and the untimely passing of Julia. The personal link between Caesar and Pompey. Now, the two remaining titans, once allies, stood poised as bitter rivals. Pompey, the great general who had cleared the seas of pirates and conquered the East, had slowly but surely drifted away from Caesar and into the conservative embrace of the Senate. He attempted negotiations, offering concessions, but the Senate, convinced of their strength with Pompey at their side, refused to compromise. This shallow stream marked the sacred boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law strictly forbade a general from leading his army across this river and into Italy while still holding command, under penalty of treason. To cross it with his legions was to declare war on the Republic. The Senate, along with Pompey and many of their supporters, fearing Caesar's reputation for ruthlessness, abandoned the city in haste, fleeing south across the Adriatic to Greece. They left Rome open for Caesar to enter unopposed. Caesar, however, was not interested in bloody purges like Sulla. It was the clash of the two greatest generals of the age. Caesar, however, was horrified by the betrayal and the murder of his former son-in-law and fellow triumvir. He settled the dispute over the Egyptian throne, famously siding with Cleopatra VII, the charismatic and ambitious queen, in her struggle against her brother. His involvement in Egypt was not merely romantic, secured immense Egyptian wealth for his depleted war chest, and ensured a crucial grain supply for Rome. Caesar's veterans, forged in the brutal campaigns of Gaul, fought with an unmatched discipline and ferocity. He defeated Cato the Younger and other optimates in Africa at the Battle of Thapsus, where Cato famously committed suicide rather than live under Caesar's rule. Finally, in 45 BC, he crushed Pompey's surviving sons at the Battle of Munda in Spain, a hard-fought victory that proved to be his last major military engagement. Caesar employed a daring tactic, holding back a hidden fourth line of infantry that surprised and broke Pompey's cavalry, then enveloped his legions. The defeat was devastating for Pompey. He fled the battlefield, seeking refuge in Egypt. He secured Rome, its treasury, and its political machinery, and then embarked on a relentless pursuit of Pompey and the Republican forces. He hesitated, contemplating the immense weight of his decision. Caesar, defying all odds, consistently outmaneuvered his opponents, despite often being outnumbered and facing logistical challenges. He had fought his way from the banks of the Rubicon to ultimate, singular power. He had chosen to be a conqueror of Rome, not just its servant. The Republic, shattered by decades of internal strife, and now subjugated by the will of one man and his loyal legions, lay prostrate before him. What he would do with this absolute power, and whether Rome could ever truly recover its lost freedoms, remained to be seen. The answer would soon be written in blood. His campaigns were a masterclass in military strategy and leadership. In Spain, he brilliantly defeated Pompey's legates. But the decisive confrontation came in Greece. Plutarch recounts that Caesar paused, wrestling with the momentous choice, perhaps even shedding a tear. But his resolve hardened. Looking at his loyal soldiers, he famously declared, "Alia iacta est." The die is cast. A phrase that has echoed through history as the definitive moment of no return. They issued a senatus consultum ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate, a measure typically reserved for dire emergencies, which effectively declared Caesar an enemy of the state if he did not comply. It was, in essence, a declaration of war. He was massively outnumbered by Pompey's forces and the legions loyal to the Senate. But Caesar possessed something his enemies underestimated: speed, audacity, and the unshakable devotion of his veteran soldiers. He moved with lightning precision. Town after town in Italy, unprepared for his swift advance, fell to him without a fight. The speed of his approach stunned his opponents. Pompey and the Senate, still mobilizing and convinced they had time, were caught entirely off guard. The Optimates, the staunchly traditionalist faction, led by unwavering Republicans like Cato the Younger, loathed Caesar. His extraordinary proconsular command was nearing its legal end. They demanded he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. This demand was not simply about upholding the law. It was a political trap. As a private citizen, Caesar would be vulnerable to a myriad of lawsuits and prosecutions for alleged illegalities during his time in Gaul, charges carefully prepared by his enemies. These charges, whether fair or not, could strip him of his vast wealth, ruin his reputation, and permanently sideline him from Roman politics. To return without his legions was to invite political oblivion, perhaps even death. They saw his populism, his extravagant spending, his boundless ambition, and his fiercely loyal legions as an existential threat to the very fabric of the Republic. They feared he intended to become another Sulla, or worse, a king. Pompey, though initially hesitant, was ultimately persuaded to become the Senate's champion, their bulwark against Caesar's perceived tyranny. He was given sole consulship, an unprecedented move that granted him immense, almost dictatorial, power, supposedly to restore order to Rome's chaotic politics. The Senate, with Pompey now its military arm, began to issue ultimatums to Caesar. Caesar understood the game. His options were stark: submit to the Senate's demands and risk ruin, or defy them and plunge Rome into another civil war. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood on the banks of a small, insignificant river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. With that fateful utterance, Caesar led his single legion, the 13th, across the Rubicon. It was an audacious gamble. Panic seized Rome. The ensuing civil war was fought across the entire Roman world, from Italy to Spain, from Greece to Africa. In 48 BC, at the Battle of Pharsalus in central Greece, Caesar's army, though significantly outnumbered, faced Pompey's much larger forces. Caesar pursued him to Egypt, arriving shortly after Pompey had been brutally assassinated on the orders of King Ptolemy XIII, a young pharaoh hoping to gain Caesar's favor. After his sojourn in Egypt, Caesar spent the next few years meticulously stamping out the last vestiges of republican resistance. After nearly 5 years of relentless civil war, Caesar stood as the undisputed master of the Roman world. After nearly 5 years of relentless civil war, a conflict that had dragged its bloody tendrils across the entire Roman world, Gaius Julius Caesar stood as the undisputed, singular master of Rome. His victories at Pharsalus, Thapsus, and Munda had eliminated all organized opposition. These parades were designed not just to honor him, but to dazzle the Roman populace, to solidify his image as Rome's savior and unifier. Wagons laden with gold and silver, exotic animals, and thousands of captured enemies paraded through the streets, culminating in sacrifices to the gods. They brought a much-needed sense of order and purpose after years of chaos. He was already Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. Was repeatedly elected consul, effectively monopolizing the highest office. Was granted unprecedented powers over the military since the expulsion of the last king, Tarquin the Proud, centuries earlier. The very word rex was anathema, a symbol of tyranny. They watched with growing horror as Caesar dismantled the very system they cherished. For them, liberty was not just freedom from a king. It was freedom from any single individual holding absolute, permanent power. To them, Caesar was a tyrant, and tyranny, according to Roman tradition, justified assassination. Then, Publius Cerealius Casca struck the first blow, a glancing stab to the neck. He suffered 23 stab wounds. The assassins, daggers still dripping, then rushed out into the forum, waving their blood-stained blades, proclaiming liberty. The Roman people, exhausted by civil war and dependent on Caesar's reforms, were not filled with joy. They were filled with fear. The Republic was not restored that day. It had merely lost its most powerful figure, plunging Rome once more into a perilous power vacuum and setting the stage for yet another, even more brutal, round of civil war. The architects of Caesar's death would soon discover that killing a tyrant was far easier than resurrecting a dead republic, and the king is dead. They expected to be hailed as heroes, as the saviors of the republic. Caesar fought back, but as the other conspirators rushed forward, daggers flashing, he was overwhelmed. Legend has it that upon seeing Marcus Brutus among his attackers, Caesar uttered his famous last words, "Et, Brute, you too, Brutus," profound expression of shock and betrayal from a man who had shown Brutus's mercy and even elevated him. Among these concerned senators were many who had been pardoned by Caesar himself. Men like Marcus, Junius, Brutus, and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus, in particular, was a descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, one of the founders of the Republic who had expelled the last king. He saw himself as upholding his ancestral duty to liberty. Caesar, deliberately or carelessly, seemed to flirt with this forbidden title. For others, it was fear of losing their own power and status in Caesar's new order. For still others, it was personal resentment or ambition. They believed that by removing Caesar, they could magically restore the Republic to its former glory, as if simply decapitating the tyranny would bring back freedom. They fundamentally misunderstood the depth of the systemic rot, the loyalty of Caesar's legions, and the exhaustion of the Roman populace, who yearned for peace above freedom. He appeared in public, dressed in the purple robes of a triumphing general, a color associated with royalty. He sat on a golden chair. They chose the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, as the day for their act. It was a meeting of the Senate, specially convened in the Curia of Pompey, a theater complex built by Caesar's former rival. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul, was shrewdly distracted outside the building by another conspirator, preventing him from entering with Caesar. His image was placed on coins, an honor previously reserved for gods or long-dead heroes. Statues were erected in his honor, some even bearing inscriptions like to the unconquered god. At the Roman festival of the Lupercalia, Mark Antony, as consul, publicly offered Caesar a diadem, a royal crown, which Caesar dramatically refused. But the gesture itself, the very public offering, sent shivers down the spines of many senators. It confirmed their worst fears. Caesar was indeed aiming for a crown. But then came the truly alarming titles. He was named dictator for 10 years, a term unheard of since Sulla, but still technically within Roman legal precedent for extraordinary times. Then, in 44 BC, just weeks before his death, he was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This was an utterly unprecedented title, completely alien to the Republican Constitution. It effectively made him an uncrowned monarch, a permanent ruler whose power was beyond legal challenge or temporal limit. But the manner in which they were implemented raised deep alarm among the traditional Roman elite. Caesar passed these laws through his own authority, often bypassing or simply ignoring the Senate and the assemblies. He was not just a powerful figure, he was effectively the state itself. But even amidst this spectacle, there were subtle, disquieting notes. Caesar was celebrating victories not over foreign enemies alone, but over fellow Romans, however cleverly disguised his triumphs were as conquests of distant lands. The Republic, that venerable system of checks and balances, of annually elected magistrates, and the power of the Senate, lay prostrate before him. Its institutions hollowed out, its traditions shattered. He understood the desperate need for stability and order. He embarked on massive public works projects. New forums, temples, and theaters rose from the ground, providing employment for the urban poor. He initiated land distribution schemes for his veterans and the landless citizens, addressing the very issue that had fueled the Gracchi's ill-fated reforms. He reformed the convoluted Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar, a system so accurate it remains largely in use today. He regulated the grain dole, a massive public handout to the urban poor to reduce corruption and ensure more equitable distribution. He even expanded the Senate to 900 members, bringing in new men from Italy and even Gaul, diluting the power of the old aristocratic families and making it, at least on paper, more representative of Rome's expanded citizenry. He worked to reorganize the administration of Rome's vast provinces, seeking to reduce the rampant corruption that had long plagued them. Caesar, the audacious general who had crossed the Rubicon, now faced a new challenge: what to do with the absolute power he had seized, and how to govern a broken state and a vast, wounded empire. Caesar's return to Rome was marked by a series of magnificent triumphs, lavish celebrations of his military victories over Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Africa. Upon his return, Caesar immediately embarked on an ambitious program of reforms, tackling many of the systemic problems that had plagued the Republic for decades. These reforms were bold, far-reaching, and undeniably effective in many ways. And it was his accumulation of titles and honors that truly fueled the growing resentment and fear. This went far beyond merely solving Rome's problems. It fundamentally altered the very nature of Roman governance. The Republic abhorred kingship above all else. The Republican faction, though militarily defeated, had not vanished. Their motivations were complex. For some, it was genuine ideological conviction, a belief in the Republic above all else. The conspiracy took shape in secret. Over 60 senators joined the plot, the liberators, as they called themselves. As Caesar entered the Curia, surrounded by the conspirators, he was first approached by Tilius Cimber, who presented a petition, seizing Caesar's toga as a signal. Caesar fell at the foot of a statue of his old rival, Pompey the Great, a symbolic end to the man who had overcome so much. But the reaction was not what they had anticipated. Instead of cheers, there was shock, confusion, and then a terrifying silence. The Ides of March, 44 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life, lay dead at the base of Pompey's statue. His assassins, the self-proclaimed liberators led by Brutus and Cassius, rushed out into the forum, their daggers still glistening, crying out for liberty and the Republic. They fully expected to be met with the hero's welcome, to be hailed as the saviors who had freed Rome from tyranny. Instead, they found not jubilation, but a stunned, terrified silence. Antony, standing before the vast, restless crowd, delivered a funeral oration that was a masterpiece of rhetorical manipulation. He then produced Caesar's blood-stained toga, wheedled with the very holes from the assassins' daggers, pointing out each wound. He controlled the capital, commanded a significant political following, and appeared to be the natural successor. He began to consolidate his power, taking actions in Caesar's name, often using Caesar's vast sums of money and his unpublished directives to bolster his own position. He was building his own power base on the foundations Caesar had laid. When Antony, who had already spent much of Caesar's funds, procrastinated or refused, Octavian began to sell off his own family's properties to pay the legacies promised by Caesar to the common citizens. This act of personal sacrifice, leveraging Caesar's popularity and Antony's perceived stinginess, resonated deeply with the Roman populace and Caesar's veterans. He displayed a wax effigy of Caesar, realistically depicting his many stab wounds. The sight inflamed the already agitated populace. Antony saw Octavian as an upstart, a threat to his legitimate claim as Caesar's successor. Despite their bitter personal animosity, they shared a common enemy in the assassins of Caesar, and a common goal in controlling Rome. And so, the two men, along with the third, less significant Caesarian general named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, met on a small island near Bonunia. They entered into a formal, legally recognized alliance, backed by an army of 43 legions. This was the second triumvirate. Octavian, in turn, saw Antony as an obstacle to his inherited destiny. Its primary purpose was clear: to eliminate all remaining political opposition, particularly the conspirators who had killed Caesar and to consolidate their grip on power. As a great orator who had famously denounced Antony and his Philippics, the liberators, Brutus and Cassius had gathered their forces in their remaining republican legions in Greece, preparing for a final showdown. The stage was now set for the ultimate reckoning, a battle that would decide not just the fate of the assassins, but the future of Rome itself. The civil wars were far from over. They were simply about to enter their most decisive and brutal phase. And had championed young Octavian, believing he could be controlled, found himself on the proscription lists due to Antony's vehement insistence. Octavian, despite Cicero's earlier support, shockingly acquiesced to Antony's demand. Cicero attempted to flee, but was captured and brutally murdered, his head and hands famously displayed in the Forum, a grim warning to any who dared oppose the triumvirs. The voice of the Republic was silenced permanently. Their method of choice harked back to the darkest days of Sulla. The proscriptions, lists of enemies were drawn up, condemning thousands of Romans, senators, and equities to death without trial, their property confiscated to fund the massive armies needed for the coming war. This time, the purge was more widespread and ruthless than Sulla's, reaching deep into Roman society. Personal vendettas were settled under the guise of state necessity. The verbal sparring escalated. The great orator Cicero, a staunch Republican who had been sidelined by Caesar, saw in Octavian a potential tool to restore the Republic. He believed he could use the young man to undermine Antony, whom he vehemently despised and publicly attacked in a series of scathing speeches known as the Philippics, comparing him to a pestilence and a gladiator. Cicero foolishly believed he could manipulate Octavian, then cast him aside once Antony was dealt with. He underestimated both young Octavian's ruthlessness and his ultimate aim. The mood shifted from mourning to outrage, then to a furious demand for vengeance. The Senate, egged on by Cicero, declared Antony a public enemy and sent an army, including the young Octavian with his newly raised legions, to confront him. He had learned from Caesar's example. Political power ultimately rested on military strength and the loyalty of legions. He marched his victorious legions on Rome, demanding the consulship for himself and the official annulment of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum that had made Caesar an enemy. The Senate, lacking any military force of its own, was powerless. At just 19 years old, Octavian was elected consul. Battles were fought, and Antony was defeated and forced to flee over the Alps. The crowd erupted into a riot, seizing burning brands from the funeral pyre and rushing through the streets, seeking out the assassins. Brutus and Cassius, along with the other liberators, were forced to flee Rome for their lives, becoming fugitives from the very people they claimed to have liberated. Antony had successfully turned public opinion decisively against them. He praised Caesar's achievements, his generosity, and his love for the Roman people. He listed Caesar's military triumphs and his numerous kindnesses. Just weeks after the assassination, a frail, almost sickly 18-year-old youth named Gaius Octavius arrived in Rome from Apollonia, where he had been studying and undergoing military training. He was Caesar's great-nephew, a relatively obscure figure, seemingly too young and too inexperienced to pose a threat. But Octavius carried an astonishing secret. Caesar's will had officially adopted him, making him Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Caesar's legal son and primary heir. Then, with carefully timed dramatic flair, he revealed Caesar's will. It meant Octavian, not Antony, was Caesar's rightful successor in the eyes of the law, and, crucially, in the hearts of Caesar's fiercely loyal veterans. Antony, who had expected to be Caesar's sole heir, initially dismissed Octavian as a mere boy, calling him that child. He tried to buy him off, to sideline him. But Octavian possessed a cunning, an ambition, and a steely resolve that belied his youth and delicate appearance. He understood the immense power of Caesar's name, particularly among the legions. The crowd learned that Caesar had bequeathed a considerable sum of money to every Roman citizen and had left his magnificent gardens across the Tiber as a public park. Caesar, the alleged tyrant, had loved the Roman people more than their self-proclaimed liberators, the Roman populace. Weary of decades of civil strife and benefiting directly from Caesar's reforms and generous distributions, did not share the conspirators' idealized vision of republican freedom. They simply feared a return to chaos. Shops closed, streets emptied, and an eerie apprehension settled over the city. The immediate aftermath was a perilous power vacuum. Rome hovered on the brink of anarchy. Into this void stepped Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul and most trusted general. Antony was a man of contrasts, a charismatic and skilled orator, a fierce and courageous soldier who had fought alongside Caesar in Gaul in the civil wars, but also prone to excesses, known for his drinking, gambling, and a volatile temper. While the conspirators had debated whether to kill Antony as well, Brutus, believing in the purity of their cause, argued against it, famously stating their aim was justice, not butchery. His decision proved to be a fatal miscalculation for the liberators. Antony, initially in shock, quickly regained his composure. He immediately seized Caesar's papers and, crucially, his will. He secured his position as consul and began to negotiate with the conspirators. A fragile truce was reached, an amnesty for the assassins in exchange for a state funeral for Caesar, complete with the public reading of his will. This was Antony's masterstroke. The funeral, held a few days later in the Forum, became a pivotal moment in Roman history. As Antony recounted Caesar's benefactions, he subtly stoked the crowd's anger. With the conspirators driven from Rome, Antony seemed poised to inherit Caesar's mantle. But then, an unexpected and seemingly insignificant figure arrived on the scene, disrupting Antony's carefully laid plans. This posthumous adoption was a political bombshell. Octavian immediately demanded his inheritance, the vast sums of money Caesar had bequeathed to the Roman people and to him. The relationship between Antony and Octavian rapidly deteriorated into a bitter rivalry. The political situation spiraled into fresh conflict. Antony marched his legions north to seize control of Cisalpine Gaul from one of Caesar's former generals. However, the Senate's celebration was short-lived. Octavian, having tasted military victory, refused to cooperate further with them. With the Senate cowed and the liberators still at large in the east, a chilling realization dawned upon Antony and Octavian. They needed each other to survive. Unlike the informal First Triumvirate, this new alliance was sanctioned by law, and it was far more brutal. The tragic irony of this era was never more apparent than in the fate of Cicero. With their enemies purged and their vast armies funded by the confiscated wealth, the Second Triumvirate turned their gaze eastward. With their enemies ruthlessly purged from Italy through the bloody proscriptions, and their massive armies financed by confiscated wealth, the Second Triumvirate, Mark Antony, young Octavian, and the increasingly marginalized Lepidus, turned their gaze eastward. There, in Greece and Asia Minor, lay their formidable enemies, Marcus, Brutus, and Gaius, Cassius, Longinus, Caius, the chief assassins of Julius Caesar, who had gathered the remnants of the Republican forces and cultivated powerful new alliances. They had raised formidable armies, levied heavy taxes, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Brutus, renowned for his moral integrity, and Cassius, a seasoned and cynical military strategist, led legions composed of hardened veterans and newly raised troops in the first engagement. Antony confronted Cassius, while Octavian faced Brutus. His army had suffered a psychological blow, and their supplies were dwindling. Antony and Octavian, despite some setbacks, maintained their offensive pressure, knowing that time was on their side. There were no more great champions of the old order capable of raising an army against the Caesarian faction. The last daggers that had slain Caesar had been avenged, and the path was cleared for Caesar's heirs to reshape Rome in their image. The victory at Philippi fundamentally altered the political landscape. shifting absolute power firmly into the hands of the triumvirs. This vast domain included Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and, most crucially, Egypt, with its immense resources and its captivating queen, Cleopatra. Antony's task was to restore order, levy heavy taxes to pay their massive armies. Antony, immersed in the luxurious courts and ancient cultures of the East, found himself increasingly drawn to Cleopatra, a woman of legendary charm, intellect, and political acumen, who represented the immense wealth and strategic importance of Egypt. Octavian, meanwhile, began the painstaking work of consolidating his power in the West, establishing a disciplined administration, and carefully cultivating his image as the restorer of order and the bringer of peace to worry Italy and prepare for a long-anticipated war against the Parthian Empire, Rome's formidable rival in the East. But the stage was now set for the final, inevitable confrontation. The division of the world created two distinct spheres of influence, two very different approaches to governance, and two powerful personalities that would ultimately clash for sole supremacy. The Republic was dead, its liberators vanquished, but the question of who would ultimately rule Rome and what form that rule would take remained unanswered. The shadow of civil war still loomed large, a final reckoning waiting to unfold. This was the richer, more prestigious half of the empire, and it appealed to Antony's grand, somewhat theatrical nature. Antony, true to his reputation as a fierce and effective field commander, overwhelmed Cassius's forces. This included Italy itself, Gaul, and Spain. This was a politically challenging assignment. Italy was exhausted by the civil wars, its economy in tatters, its lands needing redistribution to Caesar's and the triumvir's victorious veterans. It required immense political skill, patience, and a methodical approach to reconstruction. It was a less glamorous but strategically vital portion of the empire, with the direct pulse of Roman identity and public opinion lay, and with his supply lines stretched thin, was forced into a decisive battle against Antony and Octavian. This time, the fighting was even more brutal and prolonged. Lepidus, whose contribution at Philippi was minimal and whose political influence was already waning, was effectively sidelined, relegated to governing only the minor province of Africa. He was a triumvir in name only, a powerless third wheel. Antony once again distinguished himself, leading his legions with inspiring courage and tactical brilliance. Octavian, despite being ill, played his part, though he relied heavily on his general Agrippa. The battle eventually turned into a rout for the Republican forces. Brutus's legions were decisively broken. Facing capture and knowing the cause of the Republic was lost forever, Brutus, too, committed suicide. He famously quoted a line from Euripides: "O wretched virtue, you were but a word, and I have practiced you as a reality. But you were subject to fortune." Cassius, believing that Brutus's wing had also been defeated and that all was lost, tragically ordered his freedmen to kill him. Yet, ironically, Brutus's forces had actually pushed back Octavian's legions, even storming his camp. When Brutus heard of Cassius's death, he was devastated, having lost his co-commander and dear friend. Despite his partial victory, the overall strategic advantage now lay with the triumvirs, many of whom still believed they were fighting for the ancient ideals of republican liberty against the tyranny of Caesar's heirs. They commanded a force arguably superior in numbers and holding a strong defensive position. This was to be the final, cataclysmic showdown between Caesar's avengers and the self-proclaimed liberators of the Republic. It was a flat plain, strategically chosen by the liberators for its defensive advantages. The triumvirs, Antony and Octavian, leading their legions, arrived from the west, eager to avenge Caesar's murder. Lepidus, the third triumvir, remained behind in Rome, guarding Italy, his influence already waning. The stakes could not have been higher. The future of Rome would be determined by the clash of these armies. Brutus and Cassius, having fled Rome in the chaotic aftermath of the Ides of March, had spent the intervening years consolidating their power in the eastern provinces. The two vast armies converged in the autumn of 42 BC, near the city of Philippi in eastern Macedonia. The Battle of Philippi was not one single engagement, but effectively two distinct battles fought on the same plain, separated by a few weeks. Tense stalemate followed for several weeks. Brutus, with Cassius gone, struggled to maintain morale. Then came the second engagement at Philippi. Brutus, facing mounting pressure from his officers, the deaths of Brutus and Cassius marked the definitive end of the Republican cause. Following this monumental triumph, Antony and Octavian, now undisputed masters of the Roman world, proceeded to formally divide the vast empire among themselves. The world was now carved between the two real powers. Mark Antony, the senior and more celebrated general of Philippi, took control of the wealthy East. Octavian, despite his relative youth and more reserved personality, secured the West. The division, however, was not without inherent tensions. For a time, an uneasy peace settled over the Roman world. A fragile tranquility born of exhaustion and the overwhelming power of the two dominant triumvirs, with the bloody victory at Philippi secured. In the Roman world formally divided between them, Mark Antony and Octavian, the two dominant figures of the second triumvirate, embarked on vastly different paths. Lepidus, the third triumvirate, faded into obscurity, a mere figurehead, leaving the immense power of Rome effectively in the hands of two very different men. This was a strategic decision, but also one that perfectly suited his flamboyant temperament. The East was rich, vast, and steeped in ancient cultures. It offered immense financial resources to pay his legions and launch the eagerly anticipated campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's formidable rival that had humiliated Crassus. He married her, had 3 children with her. His task was less glamorous but politically vital: restore stability to Italy, settle Caesars and the triumvir's veterans on land, manage the volatile Roman populace, and secure the vital grain supply. And in what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, he officially recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true heir and granted vast Roman territories in the east to Cleopatra and their children. But as a patriotic struggle against an external Oriental threat posed by Cleopatra, with Antony as her hapless servant, the world was not big enough for two masters. Antony, increasingly isolated by Octavian's shrewd political maneuvering and devastating propaganda, is prepared for the inevitable confrontation. His grand eastern army, paid for by Egypt, was formidable, but his personal conduct had alienated many traditional Romans and even some of his own allies. The final decisive conflict was now unavoidable. A direct clash between East and West, between two powerful men vying for sole control of the Roman world. The final breath of the Republic was imminent, to be exhaled in the dramatic theater of a naval battle. He convinced the Roman Senate and people that Cleopatra, through Antony, threatened to enslave Rome and bring about the downfall of its very identity. This narrative resonated deeply with the population, weary of internal strife, but fiercely proud of their Roman heritage. These acts, though politically astute in the East, were deeply offensive and alarming to Roman sensibilities back in Italy. His task was to organize the provinces, levy taxes, and prepare for this grand military undertaking. But the East also offered a seductive allure of luxury, ancient customs. In the captivating presence of its most powerful monarch, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, he was outwardly calm, composed, and methodical, a stark contrast to Antony's more impulsive and hedonistic nature. He understood the profound weariness of the Roman people and their desperate longing for peace and stability. He set about portraying himself as the true champion of Roman values, the disciplined leader dedicated to the well-being of Italy. Antony, the charismatic and seasoned warrior, chose the East. He rebuilt infrastructure, maintained the grain supply, cultivated relationships with the Roman Senate and people, always presenting himself as a traditional republican, even as he quietly accumulated immense personal power. Antony delved deeper into his relationship with Cleopatra. Octavian painted a terrifying picture back in Rome. He portrayed Antony as a Roman corrupted by Eastern decadence, bewitched by a foreign queen, and abandoning his Roman duties for an un-Roman lifestyle. He accused Antony of being a puppet of Cleopatra, of planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, and of intending to subjugate Rome itself to an Egyptian queen. The donations of Alexandria were presented as a blatant betrayal of Roman interests, a gifting of Roman territory to a foreign dynasty. He leveraged Roman xenophobia and their deep-seated fear of kingship. In 41 BC, he summoned her to Tarsus, ostensibly to account for her loyalty during the civil wars. Cleopatra, however, arrived not as a supplicant, but as a goddess. She sailed up the Kidnus River in a magnificent gilded barge with purple sails, rowed by silver oars, keeping time to flutes and lyres. Dressed as Venus, surrounded by cupids and nymphs, she presented herself as a living deity, a potent symbol of ancient Egypt's splendor. Antony, the rough Roman soldier, was utterly captivated. Antony had first met Cleopatra years earlier when she had famously arrived in a rolled-up carpet to meet Julius Caesar in Alexandria. What began as a political meeting quickly blossomed into a passionate, consuming affair. Antony followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, abandoning his duties for months, indulging in a life of luxury and shared intellectual pursuits. Cleopatra was not merely beautiful. She was highly intelligent, multilingual, and a shrewd political operator, a true monarch in her own right. She saw in Antony not just a lover, but a powerful Roman general who could help her restore Egypt to its former glory and secure her dynasty. Antony, in turn, found in her a partner who understood power and ambition, stark contrast to the stern, traditional Roman matrons. Over the next decade, Antony's focus became increasingly centered on Egypt and Cleopatra. While Antony was immersed in the grandiosity and Eastern luxuries of Alexandria, Octavian was diligently, patiently, and ruthlessly consolidating his power in the West. Octavian was a meticulous administrator and a master of propaganda. He carefully managed the often unpopular task of settling veterans, ensuring their loyalty. But Octavian's most potent weapon was his propaganda war against Antony. Octavian meticulously framed the coming conflict not as another Roman civil war, despite attempts at reconciliation, including the short-lived Treaty of Tarentum and Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia. The chasm between the two triumvirs grew ever wider. The uneasy truce that had persisted between Mark Antony and Octavian, a fragile peace patched together by political necessity rather than genuine reconciliation, was now irrevocably unraveling. The division of the Roman world, initially conceived as a practical solution to manage a vast empire, the breaking point arrived with Antony's formal, public divorce of Octavia, Octavian's beloved sister and his own legitimate Roman wife. This act, committed in favor of his full, recognized marriage to Cleopatra, was an unforgivable insult in Roman eyes. He illegally seized Antony's will from the sacred temple of Vesta in Rome, where it had been entrusted for safekeeping. He then publicly read its contents to the Senate and the Roman people. The world, it seemed, was simply not large enough for two masters, and filled with Octavian's carefully cultivated supporters, formally stripped Antony of his powers and declared war. Crucially, they declared war not on Antony directly, for that would be another civil war, but specifically on Cleopatra, the seventh of Egypt. This subtle yet vital distinction allowed Octavian to maintain the fiction that he was not fighting a fellow Roman, but heroically defending Rome from a foreign queen who threatened its very existence. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the two massive fleets met in the narrow waters off Actium. The battle was less a grand, tactically nuanced engagement of fleets, and more a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival for Antony. Without their commander, Antony's ships soon surrendered en masse or were systematically destroyed. His vast land army, left stranded, leaderless, and cut off from supplies at Actium, held out for another week. She tried to charm Octavian, to exert her famed allure as she had successfully charmed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony before him. More importantly, the final major figure who could challenge Octavian's supremacy was gone. The civil wars, which had plagued Rome for decades, tearing its fabric apart and spilling Roman blood across its vast empire, were finally truly over. Octavian, having outmaneuvered, outfought, and outlasted all his rivals, stood alone as the undisputed, solitary master of the entire Roman world. The Republic had breathed its last. Its final champions had fallen at Actium. The question was no longer if Rome would have a sole ruler, but what kind of ruler Octavian would be, and what sort of new Rome he would now build from the ashes of the old. The answer to that question would define the next 4 centuries of Roman history. But Octavian, cold, calculating, and seemingly immune to her legendary beauty and intellect, had no intention of allowing her to live. He intended to display her in his triumphal procession in Rome, as the ultimate proof of his conquest of Egypt and the complete victory over the East. Faced with this ultimate humiliation, and unwilling to be paraded as a captive queen before her conqueror, Cleopatra chose her own end. According to tradition, she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a venomous snake, a death that carried profound symbolic overtones of Egyptian royalty and divinity. She died a queen, refusing to submit to Roman subjugation, preserving her dignity even in utter defeat. But eventually, recognizing the utter futility of their position, surrendered to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was an overwhelming, decisive victory for Octavian, secured not just through Agrippa's brilliant naval strategy and tactical execution, but fundamentally through Octavian's devastating propaganda, his strategic patience, and Antony's dramatic, self-inflicted collapse of will. His massive ships, though formidable in appearance, were slow and unwieldy in the congested waters, struggling against Agrippa's nimbler vessels. He followed them to Egypt, relentlessly closing in for the final, decisive blow. Antony, stripped of his power, his armies, and his reputation, attempted one last desperate stand at Alexandria. But his remaining forces, demoralized and depleted, were quickly defeated. The end for the tragic lovers was swift. Legend says that Antony, receiving a false report that Cleopatra had committed suicide, fell on his own sword in a desperate act. The wound, however, was not immediately fatal, and in a final, heartbreaking scene, he was brought, bleeding and dying, to Cleopatra, who had barricaded herself in her monument. He died in her arms. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's expert command, employed a strategy of relentless hit-and-run tactics, swift ramming, dismasting, and then retreating, before Antony's largest ships could bring their full power to bear. They utilized grappling hooks to board and overwhelm smaller enemy vessels. The sea became choked with wreckage, splintered wood, and the cries of dying men. Antony's heavy ships became trapped, unable to maneuver effectively, transforming into floating fortresses vulnerable to concentrated attack. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, a titanic struggle for the very soul of the Roman world. Cleopatra, observing the deteriorating situation from her position at the rear, and perhaps following a desperate, prearranged plan to save herself and her Egyptian treasury, gave a sudden, audacious order. Her 60 Egyptian ships, laden with her royal treasure, hoisted their distinctive purple sails and, with the wind at their backs, broke through the midst of the fighting, fleeing south toward Egypt. This unexpected, precipitous departure was a devastating psychological blow to Antony's already struggling forces. Seeing Cleopatra's sails vanishing in the distance, and perhaps believing she had utterly abandoned him, or in a desperate attempt to follow what he saw as their only possible escape route, Antony made a fateful, career-ending decision. He immediately boarded a swift quinquereme and followed her, abandoning his struggling fleet and his loyal, fighting soldiers to their fate. The will, whether entirely authentic or subtly doctored for maximum impact, he commanded a vast array of land troops. Nearly 100,000 legionaries, many of them hardened veterans, supplemented by numerous auxiliary units and allied contingents from the east. Octavian's land forces were numerically smaller than Antony's, but his fleet, though initially fewer in number, was composed of lighter, faster, and far more maneuverable ships, commanded by Agrippa's unparalleled naval expertise. Octavian and Agrippa moved swiftly, launching a daring blockade of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, cutting off their supply lines, and creating an increasingly desperate and demoralizing situation for Antony's encamped land forces. His naval fleet was equally impressive, consisting of over 500 warships, many of them immense, heavily armed quinquiremes and even decarems, towering behemoths designed for ramming and overwhelming enemy vessels. Cleopatra, with her immense personal wealth and Egypt's vast resources, provided vital financial backing and contributed a significant portion of the formidable Egyptian fleet. They established their headquarters at Actium, strategically vital location on the western coast of Greece, preparing for the decisive confrontation. This confirmed Octavian's direst accusations. Antony had acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's true heir, thereby undermining Octavian's own adopted status. Furthermore, and perhaps even more shockingly, Antony had made explicit arrangements to be buried alongside Cleopatra in Alexandria. To the Roman populace, this was irrefutable, tangible proof of Antony's complete betrayal of Roman identity, his abandonment of his ancestral heritage, and his seemingly treasonous intention to establish a foreign Eastern dynasty over the revered institutions of Rome. The public outcry was immense. Fear and outrage swept through the city. It was a clear, unambiguous declaration of where Antony's ultimate loyalties lay, and Octavian seized upon it with devastating effectiveness. But as a patriotic crusade against a dangerous alien external threat posed by Cleopatra, with Antony reduced to her pathetic, enthralled servant, he presented himself as Rome's defender, as a true guardian of its ancient traditions against the encroaching corruption of the East. This narrative resonated deeply with a population weary of internal strife, but fiercely proud of their Roman heritage, their Romanatus. And two ambitious leaders had instead become a source of irreconcilable tension, creating two immense, distinct power blocks. Back in Rome, Octavian meticulously painted a terrifying picture for the Roman people. He portrayed Antony not merely as a rival for power, but as a true Roman corrupted by Eastern decadence, bewitched by a foreign queen, and abandoning his solemn Roman duties for an un-Roman, effeminate lifestyle of luxury and excess. Octavian's agents tirelessly spread rumors, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated, that Antony, under Cleopatra's insidious sway, planned to move Rome's sacred capital to Alexandria, to rule the world as an Oriental despot, and, most horrifying of all, to Roman sensibilities, to subjugate Rome itself to an Egyptian queen and her half-Roman children. Each was led by a man whose vision for Rome and for himself had become fundamentally incompatible with the others. Antony, immersed in the rich and ancient traditions of the East, with its lavish courts and immense wealth, increasingly saw Alexandria in the captivating presence of Cleopatra as his true center of power. A vibrant counterpoint to the rigid conservatism of Rome, Octavian, meanwhile, had painstakingly solidified his control over the West, methodically cultivating a meticulously crafted image as the principled guardian of traditional Roman values, the bringer of peace and a restorer of order to a war-weary Italy. The friction between them, once simmering beneath the surface, now erupted into open hostility, exacerbated by a series of perceived slights, occasions, and deliberate strategic moves. He unleashed a propaganda campaign against Antony that was nothing short of a political masterpiece. To bolster these damning accusations and drive public opinion to a fever pitch, Octavian committed a truly audacious and unprecedented act. Octavian, with consummate skill, had successfully framed the coming conflict not as another agonizing Roman civil war, a fratricidal struggle between Roman generals, despite a few desperate, fleeting attempts at reconciliation, including the short-lived Treaty of Tarentum and Antony's ill-fated marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia. The chasm between the two triumvirs grew ever wider, finally becoming an unbridgeable abyss. The formal break came in 32 BC, the Senate. Now largely purged of Antony's remaining loyalists, Antony, fully aware of the existential gravity of the situation, mustered his formidable forces. Octavian, though lacking Antony's extensive personal military experience, possessed a shrewd, calculating mind and, crucially, relied heavily on the brilliant strategic genius of his lifelong friend and unparalleled admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. The stage was set for the defining clash of the age. As the battle raged, with no clear victory for Antony's forces and his heavily armored lines slowly breaking under Agrippa's relentless assault, a moment of profound drama unfolded. His sudden, inexplicable flight utterly demoralized his remaining fleet. The pursuit was swift and merciless. Octavian gave Antony and Cleopatra no respite, no chance to regroup. Cleopatra, though captured by Octavian's forces, attempted one last desperate ploy. With the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC, the last major independent power in the Mediterranean, the ancient kingdom of Egypt, was formally annexed as a Roman province, bringing its vast wealth directly into Rome's treasury. With the tragic, yet inevitable, suicides of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt, the final blood-soaked act of Rome's long civil wars concluded. The last major rival to Octavian's absolute supremacy had been eliminated. The ancient kingdom of Egypt, with its legendary wealth, its strategic position as the granary of the Mediterranean. But as a weary statesman, almost a reluctant savior, ostensibly eager to restore order and heal the nation's profound wounds, in a carefully orchestrated public spectacle, Octavian made a grand show of offering to surrender all his extraordinary powers and provinces back to the Senate and the Roman people. It was a brilliant theatrical gesture, designed, above all, to reassure a populace deeply wary of any single individual wielding absolute power. He was a master of appearances. He meticulously preserved the outward forms and ancient institutions of the Republic. The Senate still met. Its decrees were issued, elections for various magistracies were still held, and consuls were still annually elected. For over 2 centuries following his reign, the Roman Empire, under Augustus and his successors, would experience a period of unparalleled stability, relative peace across its vast territories, and a flourishing of trade, communication, and culture. The legions, now transformed into a disciplined, professional standing army unequivocally loyal to the emperor, were strategically stationed along the empire's vast and secure frontiers. They diligently defended the empire from external threats, ensuring the internal tranquility necessary for widespread prosperity. Often brutal interplay of personal ambition, clashing ideologies, deep-seated societal problems, and the relentless, unstoppable forces of historical change. It began with the idealistic, yet tragically fated, efforts of the Gracchi, who bravely exposed the profound social and economic wounds festering within the Republic. It continued through the bloody feuds of military titans like Marius and Sulla, each leaving a deeper, indelible scar of violence and the assertion of personal power over state authority. It then accelerated dramatically with the titanic, civilization-altering struggle between Julius Caesar and Pompey, culminating in the final desperate showdowns involving the passionate Mark Antony, the captivating Cleopatra, and the enigmatic, ultimately triumphant Octavian. From this crucible of unimaginable conflict, from the very ashes of a destroyed political system, one man, through sheer political genius, ruthless pragmatism, and a profound, intuitive understanding of his people's deepest needs, forged a new Rome. The Republic truly died, but from its very ruins, a vast, enduring empire rose, one that would shape the course of Western civilization its laws, its language, its heart, and its very concept of governance for centuries to come. A legacy forever etched in the name of its first and perhaps greatest emperor, Augustus. Trade routes across land and sea flourished, protected by Roman might, allowing goods, ideas, and people to move freely across the immense Roman network of roads and seas. Art, literature, and philosophy saw a dramatic resurgence, with celebrated poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid creating timeless masterpieces, often celebrating the new Augustan age of peace and virtue. Historians like Livy also penned their monumental works, reinforcing the grand narrative of Rome's past. But the cold, undeniable reality was that all ultimate power, all meaningful authority, all strategic decision-making resided solely with Augustus. He passed sumptuary laws to encourage marriage and discourage adultery, all aimed at restoring what he meticulously portrayed as the austere virtues of the old republic. He cultivated his public image with extreme care and sophistication, always portraying himself as humble, accessible, and utterly dedicated to the welfare of Rome. Despite his immense autocratic personal power, he was an unparalleled master of public relations, effectively controlling the narrative of his reign. He was the princeps civitatis, the first citizen, a humble, almost unassuming title that utterly belied his true autocratic power. He gradually, almost imperceptibly, transferred power and legitimacy from the moribund institutions of the republic to the person of the emperor. He shrewdly groomed his successors, ensuring a relatively smooth transition of power within his own Julio-Claudian dynasty, though not without the inevitable personal tragedies and political intrigues that would come to define the imperial court. By the time of his death, at the venerable age of 75, the vast majority of the Roman people could scarcely remember a time when Rome was not governed by an emperor. The Republic was not just dead. Its memory had largely faded from the collective consciousness, replaced by the enduring reality and undeniable benefits of imperial rule. This ingenious new system, where a single individual held paramount authority while maintaining the sophisticated illusion of functioning republican institutions, became known to subsequent generations as the Principate. It was the most brilliantly disguised monarchy in history. The Senate, by this point, carefully pruned and cultivated by Octavian over the preceding years and filled with a combination of his loyal supporters, he understood with clarity that true peace was not simply the absence of war, but the enduring presence of order, prosperity, and a sense of shared purpose. He literally rebuilt Rome, famously boasting that he founded a city of brick and left it a city of gleaming marble. Magnificent new forums, glorious temples dedicated to traditional Roman gods, vast public baths, and grand theaters rose across the city, embodying Rome's renewed grandeur and providing desperately needed employment for thousands of the urban poor. He reformed the convoluted and often corrupt Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar, a system so accurate it remains largely the basis for our modern calendar today. He regulated the grain dole, a massive public handout to the urban poor, to reduce corruption and ensure more equitable distribution, thus preventing the riots that had plagued earlier decades. He fundamentally reformed the administration of Rome's vast provinces, seeking to reduce the rampant corruption and exploitation that had long plagued them, bringing greater justice and stability. He established a professional, permanent fire brigade and a rudimentary police force for Rome itself, bringing an unprecedented level of safety and security to the bustling capital. Its pragmatic survivors, and those genuinely terrified of a return to civil war, predictably refused his magnanimous offer. Instead, in a powerful display of what appeared to be collective, while they begged him to retain his authority, arguing passionately that only he, with his unparalleled influence and military backing, could guarantee the continued stability and security of Rome. He immediately embarked upon a meticulous, patient, and brilliant process of political rehabilitation, and titles that subtly, yet irrevocably, shifted the balance of power. He was granted the imperium proconsular maius, superior proconsular authority that placed him above all other provincial governors, effectively giving him supreme command of the vast majority of Rome's legions. He retained personal control over the most vital and militarized provinces, such as Egypt, Gaul, and Spain, ensuring his military supremacy remained unchallengeable. But perhaps most crucially, and certainly most symbolically, the Senate conferred upon him the revered, almost sacred title of Augustus, meaning the exalted one, the venerable one, or the majestic one. This was not a magistracy or a direct power, but a prestigious, almost divine epithet that set him apart from all other mortals, elevating him to a unique, quasi-religious status within the Roman world. He would henceforth be known to history by this name, Caesar Augustus. He carefully disentangled himself from the bloodied reputation of the brutal Second Triumvirate, the purges of the prescriptions. Instead, he presented himself as the supreme restorer of peace, the healer of the Republic's self-inflicted wounds, the devoted champion of traditional Roman values, pietas, gravitas, dignitas. His controlled, methodical approach was a stark contrast to the audacious, sometimes reckless, personal style of his adoptive father, Caesar, a distinction he deliberately cultivated. And its captivating, millennia-old mystique was swiftly annexed as a Roman province. Its immense treasures now flowed directly into Rome's coffers, providing the critical financial stability and military resources that Octavian desperately needed to rebuild a shattered world. At merely 32 years old, having navigated a treacherous landscape of political intrigue, military campaigns, and ruthless purges, Octavian stood alone, the singular, unchallenged master of the entire Roman world. The question that had plagued Rome for generations, who would rule, was finally answered. The new, daunting question was no longer if he would rule, but how he would rule and what kind of state he would painstakingly forge from the ashes of the shattered republic. Octavian, unlike his fiery adoptive father, possessed a cold, calculating brilliance and an uncanny understanding of the Roman psyche. He grasped with profound insight the absolute exhaustion that gripped the Roman people. Decades of ceaseless civil war had left the population utterly weary, the economy ravaged, the social fabric torn, and the venerable political system utterly discredited. What Rome craved above all else was not abstract ideals of liberty, but tangible peace and enduring stability, even if it meant a quiet, unspoken sacrifice of the old republican freedoms. But Octavian also understood, perhaps better than Caesar, the deep-seated Roman abhorrence for kingship. He could not simply declare himself king, a rex, or even openly perpetuate the title of dictator for life. The blood-stained memories of Caesar's assassination and Sulla's terrifying precedent before him served as stark, chilling warnings. His genius lay in his subtle, incremental approach to power, a political masterpiece of carefully orchestrated deception and profound transformation. He returned to Rome not as a triumphant conqueror, imposing his will with an iron fist. The pivotal moment attained the true foundation of what would become the Roman Empire. Arrived in 27 BC, in return for his reluctant acceptance of this immense burden, the Senate bestowed upon him new, unprecedented honors. This single moment in 27 BC is universally recognized by historians as the true founding of the Roman Empire, though Augustus himself always meticulously maintained that he had merely restored the Republic. Augustus then embarked upon an astonishingly comprehensive and ambitious program of social, economic, moral, and civic regeneration for Rome and its vast empire. Perhaps his most profound and enduring legacy, however, was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Augustus also embarked on a concerted campaign of moral and religious regeneration, promoting traditional Roman values of piety, family integrity, and civic duty, which he felt had eroded severely during the civil wars and the excesses of the late Republic. His extraordinarily long reign, stretching for over 40 years, from 27 BC until his peaceful death in 14 AD, allowed him ample time to solidify the foundations of the Principate. The story of the Republic's last breath, then, is not merely a tale of a single, decisive moment, but a testament to the complex,